And Social Security wealth is large and significant for American workers. People pay in 10.6% of their earnings into the Social Security Old Age Trust Fund. And conceptually, it feels important to us from a sort of public policy perspective to account for this wealth in inequality estimates. This is both because Social Security is large. It grew from, this is just baseline estimates from the Social Security Administration itself. It grew more than threefold since 1989, from around 11 trillion to around 37 trillion. It's also because Social Security is a progressive program. And so failing to account for it by 2016 means that you're missing out on 60% of the wealth of the bottom 90% of the wealth distribution. And it's sort of, that creates a bunch of perversity in terms of how you think about sort of policy evaluation, because you have a progressive program, and given the fact that Social Security wealth and private savings are known substitutes, perversely an increase in the Social Security safety net that leads to a decrease in marketable wealth will register in wealth inequality estimates as increasing inequality, when clearly that can't plausibly be the case. And so we're going to argue for a more holistic approach to the measurement of wealth inequality that accounts for this very substantial sort of 42% of marketable wealth is Social Security wealth constitutes 42% of marketable wealth by 2016. This is very substantial. We're going to account for it in measurements of wealth inequality. And so what exactly are we going to do? Well, our hypothesis for why the literature hasn't really incorporated Social Security into existing estimates of wealth inequality is that it's kind of a hard exercise to do. It's a hard exercise to do because it requires careful study of the earnings trajectories of workers throughout their sort of lifetime in the labor force, and that is exactly what this paper is going to undertake. So what we're going to do is we're going to calculate the net present value of Social Security wealth for workers over time. The data that we're going to rely on is from the Survey of Consumer Finances, which is familiar to many of you, I imagine. For retirees, this is a pretty straightforward exercise because we know their Social Security benefits. We observe them in the SCF. So what we need to do is we need to understand how long they're going to be paid to them. We do adjustments for mortality and for inflation, and we get an estimate of their Social Security wealth. For those who are still in the labor force, this is a little bit more of a complicated exercise, and we're going to rely on some Monte Carlo simulations and some great empirical work that's been done by others in this conference to try, who I think are on this conference, to try and understand their workers' historical and future earnings trajectories to create an estimate of their Social Security wealth. Then we're going to take these estimates that are sort of cohort estimates over time for how much Social Security wealth each cohort has, and we're going to assign that Social Security wealth to the bottom 90% and the top 10% of the distribution to see what happens to sort of wealth inequality measures when Social Security is included. And sort of we're gonna recompute the evolution of top wealth shares just to give you a sort of preview of what we'll find. What we find is that excluding Social Security, the top 10% share of wealth increases by 9 percentage points. The top 1% share of wealth increases by 10 percentage points. This is consistent with work that's been done by Sias and Zuckman as well as others. Once you include Social Security into top wealth estimates, it is very important when you think about how to include Social Security to think about what the discount rate that's appropriate to use for this stream of future payouts is. This sort of idea that it's very important to think about the right discount rate to use in terms of wealth inequality estimates is a point that's been made by Eric and his co-authors sort of quite forcefully in another context. We adopts a series of approaches. Or one approach is to just use a risk-free valuation. If you do that, you see that Social Security wealth grew from $6 trillion to $42 trillion over the course of the last 3 decades, and both the top 10% wealth share and the top 1% wealth share have decreased. But there's work that's been done by John Giannakopoulos and Stephen Zeldis, as well as by Sylvain, that makes the point that it's imperative to adjust for the fact that there is a market beta to Social Security benefits that comes from the co-integration of labor and stock markets in the long run. We do this adjustment. We sort of account for the fact that Social Security is in fact risky in some sense. And we find that the top 10% share is still decreasing once we do this. The top 1% share is increasing, but very slightly by 1.2 percentage points since 1989. That is much lower than the 10 percentage point increase that's been documented when Social Security wealth is excluded. So a lot of the paper is going to be about the entirety of the paper is about how to properly include estimates of Social Security wealth into our conception of top wealth shares. It seems important then to sort of level set by figuring out like how Social Security works and what exactly and how Social Security wealth is accrued over the lifetime of a worker. So how Social Security works. Workers pay in, sort of it's split between employers and employees, but employees pay in 12.4% of their income in the form of a payroll tax. 10.6% of that goes into the old age retirement program. 1.8% of that goes into disability. Just as we exclude disability from this analysis, where our focus is on the old age retirement program, note that that's a conservative thing to do because from the perspective of this exercise, because Social Security wealth disproportionately accrues to the disability insurance disproportionately accrues to those at the bottom of the wealth distribution. But we're sort of focused on the old age program. What you see is what happens is that workers pay into Social Security up to the taxable earnings cap. In 2019, you paid Social Security or you paid payroll taxes on the first $132,900 of your income. After that, you no longer pay in. Social Security is progressively designed so that the benefits replace a higher share of labor market earnings for lower wage workers. For the majority of workers, for the vast majority, for 95% of workers, the taxable earnings cap is binding. They earn less than that. But even so, even within the sort of what is paid in, the replacement rates sort of start to fall as you approach the earnings cap over the course of your time in the labor force. And the benefits are set such that they reflect the average of the highest 35 years of earnings. Why might Social Security matter potentially to estimates of wealth inequality? Well, like we told you, Social Security wealth is huge. It's grown substantially. These are just the pure Social Security Administration estimates. It's grown substantially over the last 3 decades for reasons that we'll sort of discuss precisely why. Another reason why Social Security is going to matter to the distribution of wealth in the U.S. is that Social Security is much more evenly, it's a progressive program and it's evenly distributed, much more so than marketable wealth across the wealth distribution. And so what we've done here to illustrate this fact is we're just relying on the SCF and we're looking at retired workers and we're comparing the income that accrues to them through Social Security within each decile of the marketable wealth distribution to their capital income. Now, as you can see, there are differences because people who are at the top of the marketable wealth distribution have higher Social Security benefits because they've paid in more to Social Security over their careers in the labor force. But those differences really pale in comparison to the differences in capital income that accrue to these individuals. The rise in Social Security has a few components that we discuss in the paper. One component is that Social Security as a program has expanded over the course of our sort of sample period and over the course of the last several decades. It used to be the case that you paid into Social Security, the tax cap was set at around 1.5 times average annual earnings in the U.S. economy. That increased to be around 2.5 times in the 1980s. This means for some cohorts that we study, they're paying in much more to the Social Security program, or upper middle class people are paying in much more to Social Security because they're now bound by a cap that's 2.5 times average wages in the economy rather than 1.5 times. They're also going to get much more later sort of as payouts in the future. And for some generations that happen to be lucky enough to retire right around when this change occurs, they're just getting more out of the Social Security program as a result. A second sort of very important reason for the increase in Social Security wealth has to do with changes in the interest rate environment that occur sort of simultaneously with the documented increase in marketable wealth that's been studied. So here what we've done, just to show you that, is we've plotted the market implied nominal yield curve. This is data from economists at the Federal Reserve. What we want to highlight for you is that the discount rate has shifted way down over all horizons over the course of the last 3 decades. Another sort of interesting component of all of this is demographic. So Social Security wealth peaks when individuals are near but not yet at retirement. So they've paid in fully to this program, but they haven't yet received anything in the form of Social Security benefits that accrue to them after retirement. The share of such individuals in the economy in the U.S., is growing substantially over this period as baby boomers are reaching retirement age. And so, armed with all this knowledge about what is driving the increase, what are we going to do in this paper? What we're going to do in this paper to try and figure out how to incorporate this growing stock of wealth into wealth inequality estimates is we're going to calculate the present value of Social Security wealth. The way that's defined is it's the present value of the future benefits that are going to accrue to workers net of future taxes that they're going to pay. With some adjustments for survivor benefits, you get some Social Security, you get your sort of deceased spouses, some portion of your deceased spouses' Social Security benefits. For retirees, like I said, this is like sort of fairly straightforward exercise. All we need to do is understand how long, or estimates of how long people are going to live, and adjust for inflation and discount this future stream of cash flows. For current workers, we don't have access to their full earnings history. This is partially because we are of data limitations. We're using the SCF that gives us a triannual snapshot of sort of income and wealth. But it's also because this is just unknown. Some of these people are still in the labor force. They're still working. Like, how do we know what Eric's earnings history is going to look like at the end of his career? It's just no one knows. And so what we do to try and deal with that fact is we're going to rely on past empirical work that's been done by Gugnan et al. In 2 papers where they use Social Security administrative data. That's amazing. And we're going to rely on their labor income process that is going to match many moments of the cross-section and of individual labor market earnings dynamics. And we're going to simulate, for each worker, we're going to simulate their historical earnings and their future earnings for their lifetime in the labor force. And we're going to, we are going to assume that the parameters of the Social Security formula, how much you pay in, how much you get out, are going to scale up with the wage index, as has been the case for the last 4 decades. In terms of figuring out what the discount rate that's appropriate to use, we're going to rely on the nominal yield curve that we showed you earlier, and we're going to adjust for inflation and wage growth based on projections that come, or well, we're going to adjust for inflation based on projections that come from the Social Security Administration, and real growth of wages that also is reported there. Once we have sort of simulated earnings trajectories for workers in the economy, we are going to be left with a cohort by age, by year Social Security wealth that we're then going to ascribe to the top 10% and the bottom 90% of the distribution in a process that I will explain. So a natural question to ask about, you sort of do the simulation, like how reasonable is your simulation? It turns out it's quite reasonable. How do we know? We're going to show you some ways that we validated it. The first is you can just look and see what happens when our simulation meets the data by looking at workers who are at retirement. So you can observe their Social Security wealth directly, and we have what our simulation says their Social Security wealth that we've simulated is. And you can see that we're like really quite close with respect to what the SCF actually reports, with some differences that we can describe, or we can explain. Another exercise that we can do is we can try and see how well we match what the Social Security Administration itself reports as the aggregate value of Social Security wealth in each year. And each year they do this computation that they say reflects the cost of transitioning, of privatizing the Social Security program. For their exercise, they rely on discount rate assumptions that we illustrate in the paper are somewhat problematic, based on how not sort of the nominal yield curve that the Federal Reserve produces. It's based on how interest rates have fluctuated in the last 5 business cycles, which we don't think is right, but you can do the exercise that they do, and you can see that using their discounting assumptions, you get very close to their exact estimates. That's these, there we go. Another thing that you might worry about is the fact that we really would like to discount based on a real yield curve. The real yield curve doesn't exist for our entire sample. And we may worry about the quality of inflation projections that we're using, which we derive from the SSA. So what we can do is, for the period of time when we can look at the real yield curve, we can compare what it produces relative to what our sort of estimates of Social Security wealth are. And you see that if anything, Social Security wealth has risen, is even more important than our estimates suggest. So now that we have some confidence, hopefully, in our simulated Social Security wealth for each cohort, we then need to assign it across the wealth distribution to see how much it matters with respect to aggregate Social Security wealth, aggregate sort of wealth inequality. And how are we going to do this? It's sort of easiest to do with an example. Being in the top 10% of the overall distribution is a life cycle phenomenon. Younger workers are essentially never in the top 10%. 60-year-olds, once you're 60, 65, if you're above the 80th percentile, you are in the top 10% overall. So imagine that we take the group of 45-year-olds in 2001. Our simulation reports that their Social Security wealth is $228 billion. The SCF tells us that within 45-year-olds, the cohort of 45-year-olds, I need to be in the top 5% of the overall distribution in order to be in the top 10% overall. And so at retirement, we know that households that are above this cohort-specific distribution have 92% of the Social Security wealth. Those below have 92% of aggregate Social Security wealth. And so we ascribe for 45-year-olds, we say that the sort of top 10% is going to get 10% of the overall distribution, and the bottom 90% is going to get 90% of this total for 45-year-olds. And you see that the key assumption here is that the relationship between Social Security and marketable wealth that we observe at retirement is going to be the same for all ages. So we just assume that when we actually can see how much Social Security wealth accrues to each centile of the wealth distribution, which we can't do until workers are retired. Well, once we can see that, we assume that that holds throughout the age distribution. This is obviously an incorrect assumption, but we think it's reasonable for our exercise. And that's because Social Security wealth is concentrated in workers who are near retirement. Those are the ones who've paid in the most and who haven't yet taken out their benefits. And also for younger cohorts where this assumption is the most tenuous, it kind of doesn't matter because they're essentially never going to be in the top 10% of the distribution. And so we also do a risk-adjusted version of all of this where we account for the fact that labor and stock markets are co-integrated, and we adjust our Social Security wealth to reflect this fact. And what you see, I want to show you results because I know I'm running low on time. What you see, the sort of main headline takeaway is that the increase over the last 3 decades in overall wealth inequality is sort of reversed. Instead, wealth inequality, top 10% and top 1% shares are essentially flat once Social Security wealth is included. That's true whether you use the risk-free valuation, but even when you make risk adjustments that account for this sort of relationship between the labor and stock markets, which decrease Social Security wealth, but not in a way that has a substantial impact on the overall sort of takeaway that we have. And what we also, I think this works. What we also can see is that Social Security grows in importance to the bottom 90% of the distribution over time, just because Social Security wealth has increased so substantially, and also because the people for whom Social Security wealth is large are just a growing share of the economy. So one or several things that you might be thinking of that we'll talk about a little bit now, and I'm sure we'll get to more in Q&A. You might worry about the fact that you've heard that Social Security, the trust fund, is going bankrupt. Workers are never going to see their Social Security wealth. And so it seems kind of weird if that's the case to account for it as you do these wealth inequality estimates. Thankfully, we can take that into account directly. The Social Security Administration publishes information about the nature of the funding gap. It depends how bad it's going to be, depends on assumptions about demographics, about labor force participation. We can take the most aggressive assumption, which is that in about 18 years, it's no longer going to, the only money that the Social Security system will have to pay out to beneficiaries is the money that it generates from payroll taxes in any particular year. So the trust fund is going to be extinguished. And that sort of the result of that, without any changes to the tax regime, just existing status quo, is going to be that within 20 years, only 60% of benefits are going to be paid out to Social Security beneficiaries. And so if you make this adjustment, what you see is that as a result of this sort of the fact that Social Security is not fully going to pay out to its beneficiaries over time, you see that there is some impact on top wealth shares, but the overall takeaway isn't that significantly changed. And this is because this doesn't kick in for several years of beneficiaries who are going to see their benefits sort of totally unchanged over the course of the next decade-ish and a half. It's also true because what we know is that 60% of a very large share, like $40 trillion in Social Security wealth, is still very, very substantial to individuals in the bottom 90% of the wealth distribution. And I think I am about to run out of time. One thing that we also adjust for is our baseline estimates sort of have survivorship or life expectancy estimates that are uniform within a cohort. We know that, especially in Case and Angus Deaton have written about this recently with respect to deaths of despair, of of those who tend to be towards the bottom of the distribution, their life expectancy is actually falling over time. And so you might think that we're sort of inappropriately suggesting, and we are in fact in our baseline estimates, that everyone's life expectancy is the same no matter where they fall. We adjust for this by relying on work by Rodchetti and co-authors, where they sort of account for how life expectancy evolves across the income distribution. And what's actually quite interesting is we see that the impact of this adjustment is that it does increase Social Security wealth for the top 10% of the distribution who gets to live longer as a result of this adjustment. But it also increases Social Security wealth for the bottom 90% of the distribution, because you take years away from those who are in the first few deciles of wealth, and years are added to the lifetime of those who are in the higher deciles of the bottom 90%. And because those in the higher deciles of the bottom 90% have more Social Security wealth, they've paid in more to this program, it'll pay out more to them in their lifetime, the result is that there is a substantial increase in both wealth at the top, for the top 10% and the bottom 90. And the impacts of sort of the wealth shares that we calculate are basically unimpacted by this adjustment. And Eric and his co-authors, as well as others, have graciously allowed us to adjust to include Social Security in their estimates of existing marketable wealth inequality and see what happens. What you see is basically there's a substantial attenuation that comes from Social Security, no matter which series you consider. And just to conclude, Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman suggest that Social Security shouldn't be taken into account into estimates of wealth inequality because it would call for the inclusion of other programs like public health benefits, and it just wouldn't be clear where to stop. We argue in this paper that narrowly defined marketable wealth can't be the right place to stop, since it excludes around 60% of the wealth of the bottom 90%. And we show that top wealth shares, rather than increasing by around 10 percentage points, actually sort of haven't once Social Security wealth is properly taken into account. And we should say that this is work we hope to develop ourselves, and we hope others also will work towards a broader wealth concept that takes into account appropriately public sources of wealth when it thinks about trends in overall wealth inequality. Thanks.